Welcome everybody to this little Zoominar that we're doing on how to run an UnConference. This is brought to you very proudly by different members of the Birthday Collective, which is a loose group of volunteers. We produce many different things, including a couple of annual projects called the Birthday Books. One is a book that's written by young folks who are around 13 and below, and the other book is written by folks who are of a slightly higher vintage, shall we say. And one of the things we try and do is we have a whole range of different products in the collective that we try and use to collect stories about Singapore and try to also use it as a way to kind of capture ideas about Singapore and the ways in which it can change for the better. One way in which we'd like to do this is through a project we're calling the Birthday Collective UnConference. And some of you may not quite be aware of what an UnConference is, and we decided that rather than just run the UnConference, which is going to happen in September, around the same time as the International Day of Peace, we also thought we'd run 3 Zoominars before that as a way of sharing our thoughts with you on how to run an UnConference and then share some of those skills and experiences and expertise. So we've got a few slides that we're going to share with you today as part of Zoominar 1, which is all about introductions and inclusion. You'll see why inclusion is so important very shortly. And we're really happy that you could all be with us today. So let's just move quickly through the slides because we want to get to the questions and responses from all of you as fast as we can, really because we think that's the main part of today's conversation. So let's move very quickly to the next slide. And we'll share some quick thoughts with you. We thought it'd be useful to start with a quick introduction of who the two of us are, kind of sharing today. We'll have different people doing each of the Zoominars, and today, for better or for worse, you're stuck here with the two of us, Nigel and Aaron. We are both big fans of UnConferences. We also dabble in facilitation in various ways. I meddle in a lot of things in my life. I do poetry and interfaith dialogue facilitation, and that's actually where Nigel and I really deepened our friendship. And the item that you see on the slides here is really an UnConference that Nigel and I ran in 2019 on the issues that are related to interfaith dialogue for an international audience. We had huge amounts of fun with it, and we kind of got bitten by the bug since then, and we decided we wanted to try and do another UnConference, which is really where this project comes in.
Well, actually, speaking about bugs, it's not just we wanted to do another UnConference, but part of the reason why we are doing this webinar is actually because many people are asking us, what is this UnConference thing that you did last time? We don't understand it at all. And so I guess that's how this set of Zoominars started before doing the actual UnConference for the Birthday Collective in September. So yeah, Aaron's told a little about himself. So me, I'm like him. I'm quite meddlesome. I like dabbling in a lot of things. I'm mainly in citizen engagement. Interfaith is one of my personal areas of interest. But generally getting a greater understanding of all of us as a society and getting us to be more cohesive is something that I generally am interested in. Things that I do for the Birthday Collective. We have, Aaron mentioned the many products that we have, and I actually help to produce the podcast called Collectively Speaking, which you can find on Spotify and Apple and stuff. And there are some really interesting topics that have popped up there. I hope, and also interesting webinars and videos that the collective does. I kind of help out in that as well. So yeah.
Cool. What we wanted to do next is to really do an introduction to what UnConferences are. And so if we could move to the next slide that we're sharing with you, what you'll see on it is really this idea of what is an UnConference. And I wanted to start with the fact that if you've been to any conference at all, right, you may have heard keynote addresses, you may have heard panel discussions, you may have heard a whole bunch of different types of very structured events that were decided for you by the organizers. Well-intentioned, and I'm sure that many of those would have resulted in very meaningful content being learned and many meaningful discussions being had. But I don't know about you. I know that in many of the conferences I've been to, the most fun that I've had has not been in the structured program. It's been queuing up for lunch or getting in line for a tea break and meeting someone utterly serendipitously, without any planning, and striking up a really meaningful conversation with them. Sometimes you end up in these conversations if there's a really long line to get into the toilet, and you end up in these conversations there as well. And what some of the original organizers of UnConferences, especially the initial founder, a man named Harrison Owen, who started something called open space technology, which is the core facilitation process underpinning UnConferences. What he realized was he wanted a whole event that was just unstructured time. He wanted nothing but the lunch break and the serendipitous conversations that happened within those lunch breaks. And so that's how UnConferences were born, right? And this technique called open space technology. We are talking really about participant-driven discussions rather than organizer-driven. And over the years, UnConferences have come to be characterized by 4 rules and 1 law, which is what you see on this slide. And what we wanted to do today is we'll take you through an overview of these 4 rules and 1 law. And then in the subsequent Zoominars, we will also talk about some very specific aspects, right, of what the 4 rules and 1 law involve and how exactly we can operationalize that in the running of an UnConference. So let's move very quickly to the next slide, and I'll do a little explanation of what exactly I mean by this. The first rule, which is whoever comes is the right people, is a rule about inclusion, right? It means having an open and welcoming stance to whoever turns up for the UnConference. And that's what we'll be covering today, right? How we create and sustain a space that is as inclusive as possible. Rules number 2, 3, and 4, whatever happens is all that could have, when it starts, and when it ends. Those are all rules about the balance between structure and serendipity, right? How much we control and how much we leave open to the participant-driven process. And that's what's going to be covered in Zoominar number 2, which is on the last Saturday of July, just like today is the last Saturday of June. And then in Zoominar 3, which is the last Saturday of August, we'll be covering what is known as the law of 2 feet or the law of mobility, which basically says that in any part of the UnConference, go where you are participating and learning most meaningfully. And if you find that you're in one small group discussion, but you're not really learning a lot or you're not participating as much as you would like, then the idea is use your 2 feet, use your mobility, and go somewhere else, right, where you think you are going to be able to contribute better. And we'll be covering the idea of agency and action, which underpins that law in Zoominar number 3 on the last Saturday of August. So that's this slide. I'll hand over to Nigel on the next slide to kind of take us through a bit of an overview of today.
Yep. So as you can see, just from what Aaron shared, an UnConference is very different from your typical conference or seminar. And what I'm going to take you through right now is the general overview of what an UnConference structure looks like. So at a basic level, you will have your general introductions and icebreakers so that people will be generally comfortable being in the presence of each other. This is something probably that if you have attended conferences, you may be familiar with when they run some of these activities.
Yeah. But many conferences don't, right? They leave introductions as...
Many conferences starts with an important guest speaker and so on and so forth, and we listen politely. But in an UnConference, we really want the participants to get to know each other and be comfortable with each other. So that allows us to go to the next part, which is about setting group norms. If we're going to spend a whole day together discussing different things, we want people to be comfortable enough so that they can be honest and contribute freely as much as they can. And so that's why it's important to set the stage, so to speak, to get people to have a common understanding of what we are all willing to talk about, how far we are prepared to go with topics that we come up with, and in terms of sharing information with other people, how do we go about doing that while keeping the trust of the group that you're attending this conference with?
Yeah.
And then we have what we call a bit the meat of the UnConference, where all the ideas come out, and it's aptly called the marketplace of ideas, where basically all the participants start coming up with what do we want to talk about that will be of value and interest to all of us, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. It's a very exciting, and for those of you unfamiliar with UnConferences, it's a very interesting concept which you'll probably like a fair bit. Then we'll have break out into the small group discussions based on the ideas generated. And it doesn't end there. The small groups come back into a larger group so that everybody benefits. Feeding people is usually a good idea in any sort of conference. I'm not sure how that works in our current situation being online, but feeding people, yes. If you guys know me or can see how I look, feeding is a very important aspect of my life. Okay, so we have the general structure of an unconference: getting people comfortable, so that they are able to generate ideas of what they want to talk about, so that they'll feel safe enough to discuss things in depth when they are in their small groups, and also be comfortable with sharing what they discussed in their small groups to the larger groups. And of course, everybody leaves with fond memories of having had a meaningful conversation discussion at the unconference. So that's the typical structure.
Yeah. And we use the word typical, as you can see in the title, only as much as typical can exist, because there really is no fixed form to this. Many organizers will adjust this broad format that we've just shared in many different ways to suit the different needs that they have. If you're running a half-day event, then you'll probably stop at the meal or just before the meal even. If you're running a 2-day event, then you might have space to rinse and repeat the marketplace of ideas twice or even 3 times. If you're doing this over a long period of time, say meeting once a month, then you'd have a very different kind of structure that you would follow. But the idea is to keep customizing and keep responding to the needs of the participants, right? Which is where that idea of the marketplace of ideas is so key. So if we move on to the next slide now, what we're going to hope to do today is really start diving deep into what is going to happen in today's session, right? So the first thing we want to cover is this idea that whoever comes is the right people. And as we put on the slide here, this is a radically inclusive guiding ethos. It means we turn no one away, and it means that whoever comes, if they have bothered and put in the energy to turn up for your event, whether it's an online or offline event, then we want to honor that presence and make sure that we give them time to voice their ideas and voice the responses that they might have to other people's ideas. And what you see on this slide here, this picture, that's actually the Interfaith Unconference that Nigel and I ran in 2019, right? It was for something called the International Conference on Cohesive Societies, and they had a Young Leaders Program, which we wanted to run in a new and innovative way, and we thought the unconference technique was a good one. And you may recognize some familiar faces, from the highly activist, highly energetic people in that group. And the real big question that we have, right, if we want to set up an inclusive space, is 3 things, actually. We want to have a space that is welcoming to people and to the ideas that they bring. And when Nigel and I were discussing this, what we realized is that actually there are 3 parts to this overall inclusion, right? The first thing is we have to have good icebreakers, right? We have to make sure that we set up an activity that allows people to genuinely talk to each other, not just in a superficial, hi, my name is so-and-so, that's what my name tag says, and I work in organization A. But how can we go even deeper than that, right? So we'll talk a little bit about icebreakers after this. Then we want to talk about setting group norms as well, and how we do that in the best possible way. And then finally, we'll take you through a little bit of the mechanics of running a marketplace of ideas, because that is quite a big concept, and we want to make sure that we operationalize it in as clear and concrete a set of terms for everyone. And after that, we'll open up to questions and see if any of you have thoughts or responses that you want to share with us. So let's take this immediately ahead and go to the idea of icebreakers, right, and how we can actually run those. I found from facilitating different sets of activities over the years that good icebreakers involve 3 things. The first is that it needs to have people talk, right, and warm up their voices. Both the literal voice as well as their figurative voice, right? What do they stand for? What are their values? We find that it's really important that a good icebreaker give people the space to do that. And this means not rushing it, right? Sometimes, a facilitator might say, I only have 5 minutes for an icebreaker. But when we do that, we actually end up cutting off people's voices. And we want to give them the space to talk and warm themselves up as far as possible. Then, after they've done the talking, we also want to get people to know one another and hopefully meet one another in a deep way and potentially even make new friends. And then finally, the best icebreakers involve people moving. If we sit, kind of as Nigel and I are now, there's a certain passivity that sets in at that point. And we want to make sure that icebreakers are as active as possible. And so one example that we wanted to share with you, which we've both found very effective, is the example of a map, right? And we've called it the Singapore map because we know we're primarily speaking to a Singaporean audience here. But it could be a map of anywhere, right? Any geographical space that you are operating in. And the fun bit in this is that you can draw a large map on the floor, and I do mean large, right, to fit the entire room if that's possible, using masking tape if you like, or you can just put a slide up and help people to orientate themselves. I personally like to do this by asking the group to do it themselves, and I'll give some of them the masking tape and say, draw the map. And then you can watch people as they get a bit stressed about how to use the masking tape and, how big a map do they actually have to design. And it's funny how every time I tell people design as big a map as you can, they still end up producing quite a small one. And then later, when they do the rest of the activity, they start realizing maybe this was not such a good idea. But that's quite part of the energy of the activity, right? It's quite fun in doing that because they have to deal with the consequences of how they've designed it. But after you've got the map in space, the trick is to ask people to stand in a few different places, right? You might ask them to stand where they live, where they go to work, where they go to school, where their favorite food can be found, where they go for rest and recreation, where they met their girlfriends, boyfriends, current partners, wives, husbands. And we find that that's really useful to do, right? And each time they move, we ask them to talk to the two people who are nearest to them. What's fun about this, of course, is this works really well in the physical space, and it's amazing when you hear the buzz of conversation that happens amongst the group. But one big challenge that we'll have to deal with, of course, is how do we do this online? Right? It's a really interesting question because when we're doing this online, we don't have the benefit of that physical interaction. And there are, I think, creative ways that we can use the small room or the breakout room functions that are there in Zoom to actually allow the facilitator to go into some depth. Because the point is actually not the physical space. It's the questions that are being asked, right? It's things like, where do they live? Where do they go to work and school? And allowing that voice to get articulated from everyone there. So I see a suggestion from Joe, about having breakout rooms with zones, right? North, south, east, west, and people can sign up for different ones. That could be one way we do it. Yeah. Or we might say you end up in a small room with 8 people for a while and you only talk about your favorite food. And then you go to another room later on and you only talk about where you had your first date, right? Or where you had your first kiss or things like that. And if you haven't had one, then you might talk about where you might want to have it and things like that.
In fact, there are even programs that are out there, websites which allow you to mimic being physically present and move to groups of people whom you want to talk to. So obviously, I'm not going to advertise anything in particular here, but I'll let you know. I'm letting you know that there is stuff out there. Yes. And and I would say that running a really good icebreakers, as Aaron mentioned, about getting to know one another is if you do it right, it's almost like speed dating. And it's one of the most important things that people go to conferences for, where they say, I go there for the networking. So if you do a good icebreaker, everybody gets to quickly get an idea and a sense of who's around. And that because they already have the information, they have an idea of who they want to get to know better later during their free time. And also, rather than thinking about networking, they'll be more focused on on the program that's being run as well.
Yeah. Just one other quick thing before we move to our next slide. Hui Keng had a great question in the chat about how do we get people to move online, right? So not just the moving from one room to another that Jo mentioned in her question, but physically doing the moving. And I think that's a really interesting question because, of course, we can't force anybody to move, right? If someone is in their pajamas, under their blanket up to here, and that's how they're attending the UnConference, then, well, that's what they're doing, right? The law of 2 feet, the 2 feet are still there, but maybe not being exercised in quite the same way as they might be. But you could still encourage people and say, you know what, for the next set of activities, please stand, right? And before you stand, let's all do a couple of stretches first, and then we might say to them, move to a different section of your room for a while and have this conversation, and your physical room, and then you could say to move to a different part of your home and have a conversation there. And even just the act of standing up and asking people to, reach up for the stars, bend down, touch their toes, and then have a conversation with each other, that changes the energy of how they are moving, and it changes the energy of the overall interactions that they can have. So that might be one interesting thing to work with as well.
I mean, with Zoom and the moving around, they could just move to leave their cameras on and then move to a different part of the house or something.
Yeah, that's right.
And even that movement already will change the synergy of what's going on.
Yeah.
Even if someone decides, you know what, I'm not going to move. I'm just going to change my background.
Yeah.
Okay, that kind of works as well.
Yeah. Yeah. The last thing I thought I would say on this is we also want to be respectful of the different ways people are going to be participating in an event like an unconference. Some of us may be participating in our homes, but some of us might be doing it on the go, right? And if you're driving and listening to the unconference, it might be a bit difficult to do physical movement, although you'd be moving anyway. Or if you're in a small space, it might be difficult to do that as well. So we want to respect the choices and options that people have, but I think we can still suggest and make possibilities known to them. And the more we do that, the more I think people will realize that they can, find ways to interact in a way that is energetic for them and in a way that allows them to bring their best energy to the overall discussion. So we hope that's given you an interesting, at least, start to the idea of icebreakers. I wanted to hand over to Nigel now, who'll talk a little bit about how we can set group norms and what kind of group norms are the most important as we actually try to run an unconference.
Thanks. I'm going to shamelessly say that I'm doing this portion because it's the most important portion.
Always. Nigel always does the most important bits.
Well, actually, all the bits are important. But anyway, the reason setting group norms is actually one, for me at least, one of the key parts of really any group activity you do that you require people to share things, because you need people to feel safe. You need people to know that we have a common understanding, that we can trust each other. Because if you don't have that, then you'll end up with a lot of superficial conversations. So this section on setting group norms is really about providing those clear guidelines to everyone present, so that they understand that topics that they are going to talk about, not everyone may agree with the answers that they get or responses that they get from each other. And in a sense, it's about preempting any sort of conflict that may occur. And also the reason why we want people, why we want to, in an ideal situation, set the group norms together with the participants and get the participants to generate what the norms will be, rather than being a teacher and going, okay, class, the class rules are this, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and the class goes, yes, Mr. Core.
Everybody try and guess what Nigel's former profession was.
If you get them to co-create those norms themselves, is more likely your participants will buy into the group norms, because hey, we came up with this, then you know what? We should be happy to follow this stuff. So of course, as the facilitator, you want to steer them towards certain things certain norms that you want to happen in the conversation. So if it isn't generated by the group themselves, you might want to chip in or hint to them and ask, what about this? What if this happens? How shall we deal with it? And as a group, generally they'll talk about it and they'll come out with different ideas. One of the examples is actually on the idea of confidentiality of stories that are shared during the course of a conference. Yeah, generally for us, we see three different levels. Either A, any story shared is open season. Everybody can share it with everybody else. Or it could be B. You can share the story that I shared with you, just leave out names. Or it could be C. The story I'm sharing is something really private to me and sensitive to me. So I rather you not share it beyond the four walls of the conference. So it's something like that which the group will have to agree upon as a norm. So, and this isn't something that the norms aren't just for when they gather as a big group. It's generally useful for the norms to be reinforced when they break up into their smaller groups as well. Because when they break out into their specific topics that they are interested in, everyone in that group tends to be extremely passionate about wanting to share how they feel and what they know about that particular topic. And that's when things may get a little bit more heated and why the norms are even more important. Aaron, anything else you want to add on group norms?
The main thing I wanted to talk about is we listed some examples on this slide, right? Listening, be respectful. Nigel mentioned the confidentiality norm, and there is no science to that, right? Different groups decide different things on confidentiality. One of my favorites for unconferences is the idea of wearing multiple hats or bringing your whole self to the discussion. Because very often, if we attend a conference, say on, the financial aspects of insurance, then you're probably going to be bringing the financial and insurance aspects of yourself, if that's your job, into your attendance there. Or if you attend a conference on, the future of the Asia Pacific, then you're probably going to bring in a bit more of an international relations, trends kind of mindset into things. But with an unconference, because we don't know what the topics are, we really are bringing our whole selves in. We are bringing our intellectual selves, we're bringing our emotional selves, we're bringing all our different identities, right? Parents, children, brothers, sisters, friends. We're bringing the hobbies that we enjoy, the things that we're passionate about in and outside of work. And I think it's really important to wear all our hats and to not be shy about wearing those hats. So for me, often if that doesn't come up as a norm, I will try and suggest it to the group and say that this matters to me, does it matter to everybody else as well? And if it does, then it becomes something that actually creates space for everybody to share as widely and as openly about themselves. I know there were some questions about norm setting and norm enforcement in the chat. I suggest we take those during the Q&A later on because I think they are worth elaborating on at some length. But they'll also make more sense once we've discussed some of the other ideas around the marketplace of ideas as well as other aspects. So I suggest we park those. Not to worry, to Fadila and Agnes, we've got both of your questions well noted and we'll make sure that we come to them in the end. I noticed, by the way, that there are plenty of other really expert facilitators who've joined this call as well, some of whom are volunteers of the Birthday Collective, some of whom have written essays for us before. And just a warning shout out to you guys, we will not be shy about arrowing some of you to maybe answer some of these questions as well, because we do believe that the collective wisdom, right, is important. And in this case, because, whoever turns up are the right people, right? So we're assuming that whoever turned up today are the right people, either for asking or actually answering some of the questions.
I'm just going to say it now, Prakash. I'm looking at you.
Excellent. So now that we've got that out of the way, if we can move to the next slide, we will talk a little bit about running a marketplace of ideas. And what you see here is a visual representation of the core ideas that were discussed, again, at the Interfaith UnConference that Nigel and I were very privileged to facilitate a couple of years ago. It was a beautiful rendition, I thought, of the core things that were discussed. But how did we get to that, right? This was the final product in a lot of ways after the groups shared what they were doing. But the core idea of the marketplace of ideas is to collect the things that matter to the group, right? Both the ideas and the projects, as well as the actions that they want to take. And it's important to give people time to think about this. In a physical space, that might mean giving them, say, 10 minutes of quiet time as they all ponder before they start sharing. And in an online space, we probably will do something like pre-collect broad topics, right? And give people time then during the actual session for some quiet thinking and reflecting on what they really want to commit to. And the idea behind this is once we've heard all the different contributions from the group, we want to start clustering similar ideas from different suggestors, or what in the open space technical language is called the host, right? Someone who suggests an idea is a host and they want to host a discussion about that topic. And sometimes if we cluster the ideas, we always try and ask the contributors or the host whether they agree that those ideas need to be clustered. Because sometimes people will feel deeply possessive about what they want and they don't want to combine it with anything else. They want to discuss only that idea. And that's okay, right? Because that's how the whole idea of the freedom and serendipity of an unconference is supposed to work. And after we've got a list of the ideas, right, and more or less had consensus from the group that this is the right list, we then ask people which group discussions they want to attend, right? And the larger groups then go to a physical room in an in-person event. Smaller groups might stay in the main hall and take different corners of it. And in a Zoom kind of space, we'll assign different breakout groups to all these different topics so that there is a space for them, right? And we will make sure that those breakout rooms are well prepared for all of you and any topics that you want to have discussed. I just wanted to share two things, Nigel. Sorry, before and I'm sure Nigel will have some stories to share as well. I wanted to share one thing, which was an UnConference I attended in I think 2010 or 2011. It was a really interesting UnConference because it was about futures thinking. So it was a whole bunch of us who do thinking about the future for our jobs. And what was really funny was they ran it as an UnConference format. And there was one particular topic which nobody wanted to attend, right? So this poor guy, he suggested it, he was going to be the host, and then nobody signed up to go to his room. And so the question might be then, well, what do we do, right? What the host there did, which I thought was really very powerful, was they said, well, you can do whatever you want now. You can either go and join another group, or you can continue working on this idea if it really matters that much to you, and just take the space as a time for some individual reflection. And this person, this host of that topic, he ended up hosting himself because he said, no, you know what, this matters a lot to me, and I would value the hour to myself to actually do some thinking. And I'll share it with you guys later. You can give me some feedback about it. So it is actually possible to do that, right? We don't always have to have two or more in a discussion. It's perfectly all right to have a breakout group of one. And I wanted to mention this because I think it really sets the bar for the kind of topics that we will be interested to discuss. Because as long as someone cares enough to bring up the topic, we want to make sure that we give them the space to actually contemplate and think about that topic in the given amount of time. Sorry, Nigel.
And actually, what Aaron just shared spins nicely to what I wanted to say. So on the other end of the spectrum, sometimes you get a topic where many people are really interested in. And if that's the case, it is okay to break them up into smaller groups, to let them still discuss those same topics. Because what you want is a group size that's large enough so that everybody has a voice and be able to share, so that your discussions will be richer. So on one hand, yes, you can have one person by themselves, or you can take a big group and break them up into, say, if there were 40 people who signed up for something, you may break them up into 20 or something like that.
Or 8 times 5 even.
Yeah, or 8 times 5, depending on your logistical considerations / restrictions. One of the other things to consider, this idea of a host, it may sound a bit daunting, and what some modifications to the UnConference format that have occurred in the past, especially when working with, say, youth who may not be as comfortable being a host, is to assign a facilitator in the room. Not so much to take charge of the room, but to help guide the conversations along and help clarify the questions and ideas that are being generated in the room. So that's one way to go about it. Yeah, Aaron.
I had one other quick thought that came to mind as Nigel was sharing, and this is something that always comes up at UnConference discussions. You'll have all these super eager hosts, right, who will suggest, say, 15, 20 topics that they want to have discussed. And then suddenly when topic number 12 comes up, the host for topic number 1 will say, but I really want to go to number 12, actually. Can I go to number 12 and host my discussion? And then you suddenly find that, well, actually, yes, there's the law of 2 feet, but it's a bit hard to be in 2 places at once, right? It's the law of 2 feet rather than the law of 2 places at once. And there's a reason why Harrison Owen, I think, had that, because life is about choices, right, sometimes. And the question that we always pose to that person will be, well, you need to decide, right? Which do you care more about? This topic that you initially suggested, or the one that you have now just heard? And if the answer is the one you've just heard, then it's perfectly okay. They can go join that group. And what we'll then ask is there someone else who wants to take on hosting or being the convener of the discussion of the earlier topic so that it doesn't get orphaned or abandoned, but someone else can actually take it over? So the facilitators will create a space, right, where this kind of very fluid discussion can actually happen. And it's perfectly okay for people to say, you know what, yeah, I've decided that maybe I don't care as much about topic B as I thought I did, and I actually want to go deal with topic I now, or topic J. Yeah.
See, Aaron's a much nicer person than me. I just flat out tell people there's bad form to abandon an idea that you came up with. So you can't come up with an idea and say you want to go to someone else's idea. If you're going to someone else's idea, you're just closing your topic and it's not valid.
Unless someone else wants to take charge of it, right? Unless someone else goes,
yeah. Oh, you know what? You don't want to do it? Fine, I'll do it. Then That's totally awesome.
Yeah. So that's how marketplaces of ideas work, right? They are actually quite fluid discussions. They can take up to an hour sometimes because you want to hear the range of the discussions first, and then there needs to be time spent clustering and linking up the related ideas. And then after that, we need to have time for people to sign up and go to the different breakout rooms as well. Again, interestingly done in an online space, right? Because we don't have to walk to a room anymore, but we do find that we'll probably not rely only on the discussion during the UnConference. We'll start some of these discussions early so that there can be some online interactions amongst people as well, and hopefully some people will find stakeholders and allies and constituents for their different ideas before they turn up. It's also perfectly okay to invite your friends, right? Because, hey, whoever comes is the right people, right? So if you can get them to come along, then you know that there'll be some people who'll be interested in the idea that you have.
Aaron, there's a question by Maniam that is rather interesting to answer. How do you collect an idea? I mean, there are a few ways we've gone about it. So what would be the easiest way to go about doing it?
Yeah. Again, we're going to talk a little bit about the offline and then the online space, right? I think with the offline, what's often useful is to start by having a pre-discussion, right? Where you just, maybe when people sign up and register, you can say, what are the 2 topics you really want to raise for discussion with everyone else? And at that point, you can already start telling them, this is a format where you have to drive the agenda, not just the organizer. So tell us what you would like to hear about. And then you might specify that on a Google form, say it's 2 or 3 lines of elaboration, right? What questions do you have? And if it's a project that you want to share, what specific feedback are you looking for that would benefit you and make the discussion meaningful? And then after that, on the day itself, if people raise it again, we can invite further questions and say, does anybody want to add to this? And does anybody want to either elaborate on this idea or add related questions to it? But I think the core idea is I would minimally want 2 or 3 lines of description of what the idea is and how much they are interested to do it. And this, again, facilitators can set up a space for it, because what we intend to do for the September event, for instance, is when people initially sign up, there'll be a Google form. But then after that, we'll probably invite everybody to an online platform that is yet to be decided and named. It could be something like a Facebook group. It could be a Discord channel, for instance. It could be something like Slack. And the idea would be to start different topics. And then as you get the different threads of discussion going, it'll be quite clear which are the ones that have more traction because people are interested in them and which are the ones that are not. You could also run polls. Once you've got a series of 10 to 15 ideas, it's possible to run polls and get numerical indicators of how many people are actually interested. But I know Nigel and I tend to prefer not just the quantitative, but qualitative indicators of discussions as well. So I find that looking at what's happening in a comment thread on a particular idea, or what's happening in the discussion of a particular overall thread in a space like Slack or Discord, that actually gives us a good idea of where exactly the interest might lie.
If we go back to running an UnConference not online, one of the typical ways that we run the marketplace of ideas is literally to give participants, especially if your UnConference group isn't a very big one, let's say you have 50 people, is to give the participants some time to actually think about an idea they're interested in, write it down, paste it up on the wall at some point. Yeah. The wall will literally say Marketplace of Ideas. And then after that, the lead facilitators of the UnConference will tell them, okay, who wrote this, and get that person to make a sales pitch. A very short sales pitch about why this idea matters.
That's right. Yeah.
And from there, you get participants to vote which topics they're interested in talking about, and that's how your selection of topics occurs.
The sales pitch is important, right? Because that's why we actually call it a marketplace of ideas. The whole idea is that you make a pitch to everybody else who's attending about why this is an idea worth exploring. And that's also why the law of 2 feet becomes important, right? We'll say more about this in Zoominar 3, but the law of 2 feet actually allows almost everybody to say, you know what, actually I like both of these topics. I would like to attend a little bit of both of the discussions. I should add one more thing, which we'll discuss more, I think, in Zoominar 2, when we talk about structure and serendipity. But sometimes the marketplace of ideas that you start with is not what you end up with after an hour or an hour and a half of discussion. Yeah. Because along the way, sometimes groups realize, actually, we thought we cared about this, but we don't care about it that much. We actually care about 3 different things. So one group can collapse into 3 groups. At other times, groups B and K might suddenly realize we're talking about the same thing. So let's merge and actually enrich each other's discussion. So two groups might become one, along the way. And the law of 2 feet allows that to happen as well, because that is the way in which they are meaningfully contributing and learning most. So there's a certain fluidity about this that is very powerful. And I think it's very liberating for us that the initial idea doesn't need to be where you end up, right? You actually have the space to explore new things along the way.
Yep.
Okay. So that was the kind of broad idea of the marketplace of ideas. If we can just quickly move to the next slide, we wanted to just round up today in our discussion on inclusion. We'll start taking the questions that came from Fadila and Agnes about the group norms. And we wanted to make sure that you have a sense of what's coming up next time as well, right? Because these Zoominars are meant to be interactive and they do link to each other quite a bit. So when we get to Zoominar 2 and we talk about structure and serendipity, we will be talking about what it means to have this sort of fluid agenda, right? How do we have groups merge and combine? What does it mean when whatever happens is all that could have? How do we be true to that principle, but at the same time follow up and take action and work with others beyond the immediate unconference and actually actualize some of the potential projects that we explored? And then when we talk about the law of 2 feet in Zoominar 3, we really will look at what it means for people to have that space to participate and learn most meaningfully. Because it can be quite a daunting task to suddenly realize that you are responsible for yourself, and wherever you go, you can't blame the organizers for a program that you didn't like. It's only you, because you had to go around and you always had the choice about what to attend and what to stay with. So we'll talk about having a space to balance structure and serendipity in Zoominar number 2, and in Zoominar 3, we'll have talk about a space to exercise agency, right? And we'll also do a deep dive into norm setting at that point, beyond what Nigel and I introduced today, because the law of 2 feet works best when everybody understands what the group norms are and how they can actually be used to create the richest and safest space. Which leads us quite beautifully into the questions from Fadila and Agnes.
Yep.
Which was all about how does the group also define what happens if someone breaks a norm and what happens when conflicts start at the norm setting stage. If I can ask our slide master to just move to 2 slides down. I think, yeah, this is the one. So this is a great question. I want to do a shout out to Eddie Chu here, who is the originator of this slide. This is what happens when we talk about, when conflicts take place in relation to the group norms, right? So what do we do about enforcement of it? So responding, I think, particularly to, I think it's Fadila's question, right? What do we do when someone breaks a norm? So a lot of it depends on how the breakage happens, right? Is this a tiny stress fracture, or is it a big, huge convulsion that's happening? Because what we have here what we call an escalation ladder, right? So as we move up that ladder, the responses get more and more serious. So if we're just talking, you say, off-color comments that someone finds a little bit offensive, we will, first of all, one norm is that people should declare when that happens, right? They should declare what they call their ouch moments, right? And if they're uncomfortable, that's what they should do. And at that point, the facilitator and hopefully others in the group will remind people what the norms are and say, hey, remember we agreed on this? Let's try and work with that. And in the vast majority of instances, people will be in this sort of category if they even get to conflict at all. And once they're reminded, they actually, I think, take the feedback on board. You want to do level 2 or shall I continue?
No, continue with this, okay. and I'll handle the next question.
Okay. Right. So if the conflict happens in a slightly more escalated way, right? So it's repeated, much more intentional off-color comments. Then what we might do, the organizers, we think we might set up a room. We haven't named it yet. I'm thinking of calling it the Sayang room, because it'll be the room where we can express a huge amount of love and affection to people who need it.
Are you serious? Are we really sticking with that?
You suggested it, right? So we're going to definitely...
I suggested it.
No, it was an idea that we brainstormed. But so something like the Sayang room might exist, or we'll name it something else. But we might bring people out and have a chat with them as well, and really find out why they're feeling that way. Did they come into the unconference having had a bad day? Is something going on at home that is pressurizing them, then making them manifest some of these, more derisory or other more negative comments? And we'll have that conversation with them.
No, Prakash, we can't call it the sin bin.
And then finally, if we get to a point where other people's safety and security are being threatened, with violence. And quite honestly, I've not seen this happen before, because really the type of people who turn up to an unconference are not the kind who would do this sort of thing. But anything is possible, and we should be prepared for it. Then we would not be hesitant about ejecting an offending participant, right? But we would want to do that really only as a last resort, because we want this to be a space where everybody can feel safe, right? So that's why the first question about reminders and then escalating into a conversation is important. Once or twice in my own experience, I've had to have these conversations where you kind of bring someone to a quieter space, and nearly always they respond quite positively to that. And once they feel heard and have the norms clarified to them, they usually go back and enjoy the rest of the session as well. So it can seem a little bit scary, but I promise it's not, right? And it's a space where actually the whole community can be very nourishing for all of these personalities.
Well, one of the questions just asked by, I think was it Ying? Have we ever ejected an offending participant? To my knowledge, I haven't really, because that sometimes having trolls in your unconference can be quite valuable as well, because they provide the totally outfield perspectives as well. It's just whether everybody's comfortable with that. Oftentimes we have had people eject themselves from the whole conference and realize.
I think was it Fadila who just said she's asked someone to choose whether to leave or not? I didn't quite see who that was in the chat, but yeah, that's entirely, it's plausible to do that. I have not had that experience before, but I can imagine people have.
Let's see now. So there was a question from Agnes. Agnes's question. Have you encountered situations where conflicts start at the norm setting stage, where people don't agree what the norm should be? Absolutely. In fact, if you talk about the norm setting stage, it's almost like if you are familiar with how relationships are built, right? There's this whole storming stage. Yeah. That's what the norm setting is actually about. So, using my earlier example on confidentiality, everybody might agree. If it's a good story, we should share it with everyone. And you may have some people who go, no, I totally disagree with this. I don't want the stories to be shared. My stories are shared here because I trust all of you. But to be respectful of my story, but I don't know what would happen if the story goes out. That's one of the typical big conflicts that occur. And so how we resolve this is, okay, maybe the default mode for confidentiality and sharing of stories may be at this level. But if you don't want your story to be shared at all, you are allowed as an individual to say, I'm sharing this story, but I don't want this to go beyond that. And so that's the compromise that happens, and that's how we manage the conflicts during norm setting. Because you really want everybody to be comfortable with all the norms that are set. Yeah. It's really important that everybody agrees with all the norms. Yeah.
If I can add to this, everybody agreeing to the norms, there's also a spectrum of what agree looks like, right? Agree can be, I believe passionately in this and I want to live it out in every aspect of my life. And then there could also be other types of agreement which say, well, okay, I don't feel that strongly, but I can live with this, right? Or I don't like it entirely, but again, I can tolerate it. I think it's all right there. And there'll be some norms which we want everybody to passionately agree with, right? Like the ideas of listening hard to each other, hopefully of bringing your whole self to the discussions, because you can't have a rich discussion without that passionate agreement. But on confidentiality, like Nigel said, there may be some of us who want to do sharing of everything and others who want to keep certain things confidential. And there are actually ways for those different beliefs to coexist with one another. That's one of the great ways in which an unconference is actually a microcosm of life, right? Because there are many things which we don't need to passionately agree with, but which we can live with if they are passionately held to by other people. So I do find that it's important to specify that, and those of us facilitating the session on group norms, to respond to Agnes's question, would actually sometimes pose that question to people. If there is a disagreement, we might say, what are the things that we can all live with here, even if we don't fully and passionately agree with everything, because you don't need that for every single norm. I wanted to add one other thing, because there was a great question from Miriam about, how do we do all of this? Because it can be very intimidating for hosts who are not experienced facilitators. That is absolutely true, Miriam. So thank you very much for saying that, because we don't want to set up a set of standards here that is so intimidating that nobody comes on the 25th of September. The way in which we help deal with this is we usually will say the host and the people who are managing the topics, right? They should really focus on getting the discussion going. And what we will do as organizers is help provide facilitators who can help you manage the process, right? So you have content and product people on the one hand, and that's really your hosts and the people who suggested the ideas. And then we're going to try and find as many facilitators as we can who can help you manage the process. And some of us get a big kick out of that, right? We enjoy process work so that we can precisely help people like those Miriam has in mind, right? So that the people who are focusing on content can focus on that, and there are other people who are thinking about how the group norms are interacting with the discussions and make sure that we are true to that process as well. Sometimes you need to differentiate the tasks in order to have the most attention paid to those different sets of concerns. It's kind of the same as what we're doing now, Miriam. I don't know if you know this, but it looks like Nigel and I are managing a whole bunch of, the questions on our own, right? But we have so many wonderful people who are actually doing the really critical back-end work here, right? We've got Eng Tek, who's helping us manage our slides, because from where we're sitting, we cannot actually get to, the beautiful cameras are in our way, so we can't actually get to the slides. Yeah. And we're not techie enough to have figured out how to get to that stage. Also, we had a clicker, but the clicker
died.
As clickers do, they died, right? Today, so you can all have a bit of a laugh about that. Yeah. And then we've got Justin and Nikki, who have been, and Eddie, who are also helping us with managing a Google Doc where all your questions are being channeled, because there's so much happening on the chat, right? Not just questions, but other kind of comments and reactions as well. So we actually have a group that's taking care purely of the questions, and Nigel and I have a computer here with just the questions in front of us. So we're having to process that. So this is, in a sense, a parallel example to what you just described, where you need to separate the host function and the facilitator function. And we will be providing as much of that infrastructure as we can, because again, this is a microcosm of life, right? You can't be doing everything on your own. Sometimes you need a huge team that's backing you up.
So Aaron has just let you in on a huge secret of UnConferences, okay? Basically, UnConferences look like everything's spontaneous for the participants, but it's actually a very carefully curated and planned event. You need to choose very carefully the facilitators you're running as a team. You need to have a strong back-end team to manage all the possibilities that might happen. I mean, think about
including the Sayang room, which is what it's going to be called.
Including Sayang room. Okay, fine, we'll call it the Sayang room. So for example, simple logistics might be, okay, after the marketplace of ideas, we have 20 possible topics, but then we only have 10 venues. How we go deal with that? And your logistics team will have to help figure that out. So there is a fair bit of planning in an UnConference. Yeah.
That's why Zoominar 2 is called Structure and Serendipity. It's not serendipity at the expense of structure, right? This is not a completely loosey-goosey sort of process. There's actually, as Nigel said, a lot of very intentional planning that goes in, but it's a planning that then generates and allows and creates a safe space for serendipity. It's not a planning that constricts and restricts freedom and movement. So it's a very different kind of planning and structure, but I think it can be a very powerful, very generative sort of structure as well. So just a quick recap then on where we'll be going next. As you probably realize, I mean, having 3 Zoominars is in a way an artificial structure because the topics will be mutually interconnected. But the really important thing is to make sure to know, I guess, that in the coming months we will have a space where we can all get together, as practitioners and facilitation geeks and people who care about process work, to actually talk about all the related issues behind how we design a meaningful unconference. And we're hoping that by the time we get to September, there'll be a whole army of really literate practitioners around the activities of an unconference as well as its underlying open space technology. So in the next session, we'll do structure and serendipity, how we combine and do both of those at the same time, even though they might seem a little mutually paradoxical. And then in the last section on the law of 2 feet, we'll talk a lot about agency and action, and we'll revisit the idea of norm setting as well, so that the expression of that agency and action is done in the most powerful possible way. Any last thoughts, Nigel, before we wrap?
I need an Oreo cookie.
It's just about as much time as we can afford, I guess. It's been an hour and about 45 minutes. Both of us need to reload on sugar. I hope you have had an interesting time and conversation. If I could just ask for one thing from everybody, if you know, there's 31 of us left in the chat. We started with 39, so a little bit of attrition. Thank you to the 31 who have stayed. If I can just ask you to do to share with us in one word in the chat how you are feeling at the moment, about the idea of an unconference. It could be excited, or it could be that Aaron and Nigel have completely confused you. But share a little bit with us about how you're feeling. And of course, if you have any other feedback, you know how to get in touch with us. The Birthday Collective contact details were there when you signed up for this. We're all on a Facebook group as well. We have a Facebook page, and there is a specific Facebook group that's been designed for this unconference as well. So we'd love to have you get yourself there so that we can keep this conversation going even in between the Zoominars. Yeah. So thank you very much for all the responses from everyone. We'll just sign off with a lot of cyan-coloured sayang from Nigel and me. Clearly I wore this for a reason today. Thank you for joining us, and we're looking forward very much to having you at the next session, which will be on the last Saturday of July, same time, 2 to 4, and we'll look forward to a discussion that is equally, if not more, rich. Thank you very much, everybody. We'll sign off now.
Thanks, guys.